On July 30, 1975, a former president of the truckers' union named Jimmy Hoffa stood in front of the Marcia's Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit and impatiently fumbled around in the parking lot. This man, who had made the truckers' union the largest labor organization in the country, was very angry. It was already 3:15 on the clock, and the man he had arranged to have lunch with had not yet shown up. Hoffa was an ardent stickler for punctuality, and he could not fathom how anyone could be as much as 15 minutes late. He was dressed in a navy blue short-sleeve shirt, blue pants, white socks, and black Gucci loafers. Hoffa went to the nearest payphone next to the tool store, called his wife, and told her he had been scammed. Josephine sensed that when her husband left the house in the morning, he was extremely agitated. Before going to the restaurant, Jimmy Hoffa stopped at a Pontiac limousine dealership owned by a good friend of his. Local workers also noticed that Hoffa was irritable. Jimmy Hoffa was supposedly to meet at the restaurant with gangster Anthony Giacalone, nicknamed Tony Jack, and New Jersey labor leader Anthony Provenzano, nicknamed The Professional, who, like Tony Jack, was a member of the Genovese crime family. The reason for the meeting, Hoffa believed, was his intention to run for president of the International Brotherhood of Truck Drivers and to renew his powerful influence, which he had lost after his imprisonment in 1964. The reason for his imprisonment was jury bribery, conspiracy, and fraud. However, the mafia, with whom Hoffa had worked hand in hand in the past, did not want him back in power. U.S. President Richard Nixon signed an order to release Hoffa in 1971, just before Christmas. But in the years Jimmy spent in prison, many things changed dramatically. The family found Hoffa a successor named Frank Fitzsimmons. Frank was more amenable, and Nixon liked him a lot. The family was happy with the current state of affairs, so they didn't want Jimmy Hoffa to come back from his retirement. Shortly after, Jimmy made a call from a payphone to his wife. A 1975 brown Mercury Marquis sped out of a restaurant parking lot, nearly slamming into a truck. A delivery truck driver in the area noticed Jimmy Hoffa in the back seat of the car. He was sitting behind the driver. The truck driver also noticed a long object covered with a gray blanket. It was lying on the back seat between Hoffa and another passenger. The object looked like a rifle or shotgun. He was unable to make out the faces of Hoffa's traveling companions because of his poor eyesight. The next day, a green 1974 Pontiac Grandville that belonged to Hoffa was found unlocked in the restaurant parking lot. Police examined the trunk but found nothing suspicious. Using the description of the car in which Hoffa was last seen, investigators found the owner of that car. It turned out to be Joe Giacalone, the son of gangster Tony Jack. John assured that just at that time he lent the car to his comrade Charles O'Brien, nicknamed Chucky. Chucky, as it turned out, was on fairly close terms with the Hoffa family. The car itself was eventually recovered as well, and investigators found Chucky's fingerprints on a 7-Up bottle and a piece of paper that were in the car. Investigators hypothesized that Jimmy Hoffa had voluntarily gotten into the car with O'Brien, whom he treated as his own son. FBI agents checked the whereabouts of two people Hoffa was supposedly supposed to meet. Tony Jack Giacalone swore he was at the gym, where he worked out every day. Witnesses also confirmed seeing him at the Southfield Athletic Club gym at the time of Jimmy's disappearance. Tony Provenzano was in New Jersey where he was playing cards with friends. Each of the two Tonys said they had no idea they were supposed to meet Jimmy Hoffa. Chucky O'Brien also said he did not see Hoffa on July 30th and also gave details of his whereabouts that day. He told investigators that he delivered an 18-pound frozen salmon to the home of the vice president of the International Truckers Union, and afterward helped his wife cut up the fish and cut it into steaks. At the time of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, he, like Tony Jack, was at the Southfield Athletic Club gym. Afterward, he drove his Mercury to a car wash because blood from the fish had leaked into the back seat. However, no one from the gym or the car wash could confirm Chucky's story. 8 days after Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, search German Shepherd dogs were flown in from Philadelphia. The dogs were given a sniff of Hoffa's shorts and his moccasins. They picked up the trail and led police officers to the back seat and trunk of a brown Mercury belonging to Joe Giacalone, Tony Jack's son. 26 years later, in late March 2001, a DNA test would confirm a match between a hair found in the back seat of that car and a hair from Jimmy Hoffa's comb. Nearly 50 years later, the case of Jimmy Riddle Hoffa's mysterious disappearance remains unsolved. But the mystery here is not at all about who committed the crime. All the likely suspects have long been known, and their motives are well established. The big question in this story is where? What exactly did these men do to Hoffa, and where did they dispose of his body? In 1959, Robert Kennedy, brother of John F. Kennedy, soon to be President of the United States, appeared on The Jack Paar Show, America's first late-night talk show. At the time, Bobby Kennedy was the lead attorney on the Senate Committee on Improper Labor Practices, best known as the McClellan Committee. Speaking to the general public, he had a lot to say about Jimmy Hoffa and the Truckers Union. In doing so, he was not afraid to name names. He sat in front of Jack Paar, and their images were broadcast on black and white television in America. Kennedy then said, "There are too many citizens involved in this association to simply sit passively by and allow the leadership of this association, in the person of Mr. Hoffa, to create such forces in this country of forces more powerful than the people and the government. If we don't stand up to this, our country will be controlled not by the people, but by characters like Johnny Dio, Jimmy Hoffa, and Tony Corallo." With the exception of Hoffa, the other names were not widely known to the average American, but the directness of Kennedy's accusations was very bold and highly visible. Can you think of a single politician or member of the public who would not be afraid to go nationwide and directly name, without quibbling, the names of thieves in the law who are trying to influence the supreme power in every possible way? Robert and John F. Kennedy were not afraid of that. In the late 1950s, the McClellan Committee, named after its chairman, John McClellan, was appointed to investigate the influence of organized crime on labor unions. Although Robert Kennedy had relatively little knowledge of this field of endeavor when the committee began its work, this young Massachusetts lawyer was a quick study and a very tenacious public servant. He made no secret of his desire to expose Hoffa. Kennedy had no tolerance for corruption at any level, but the truckers' union leadership was plagued by that very corruption from top to bottom. Hoffa was always a scandalizer and a bully who used any means to achieve his ends. When he and Kennedy began a confrontation in the public arena, Hoffa, as usual, went on a personality spree, ridiculing Kennedy and calling him a boy. When the two first met at a dinner in Washington, Hoffa challenged Kennedy to an arm wrestling contest, then publicly announced his victory the very next day. Another incident occurred in a restaurant. Hoffa got into an altercation with Kennedy because he felt that the young lawyer insulted him. Kennedy was the epitome of everything Hoffa hated. Raised in a wealthy family, an Ivy League member, sophisticated and quite pleasant in appearance. But in Hoffa's opinion, Bobby Kennedy lacked courage. Hoffa believed that a real man should be able to fight, literally, to defeat his opponents with his fists when words are not enough. He was also not reluctant to use any means to achieve his goal. Hoffa believed that only success mattered, no matter what means were used to achieve it. Therefore, Hoffa believed that doing business with gangsters was essential to the success of his union. But in fact it was the mafia that benefited more from Hoffa's interaction with the mafia. While the mafia provided Hoffa with power, Hoffa provided the mafia with money, lots of money. The last straw was the pension fund. Ordinary working people in the truckers' union entrusted all their retirement savings to this union, believing they would be wisely invested and yield high dividends. However, Jimmy Hoffa gave the money to Jewish gangster Morris Dalitz, nicknamed Mo, who was one of the central figures in the Las Vegas underworld. Dalitz started out as a rank-and-file member of the Purple Gang in Detroit. He then moved to Cleveland and used money from the Truckers Union Pension Fund to build the Desert Inn and Stardust hotels in Vegas. According to information in Ralph and Estelle Jane's book Hoffa and the Truckers, Dalitz was a member of Hoffa's inner social circle. In 1949, when the longshoremen threatened to strike the Detroit Laundry Institute, Dalitz, as owner of the laundry, influenced Hoffa to intervene and prevent the strike. The McClellan Committee presented evidence that grateful Detroit laundry owners had paid Hoffa a substantial amount of money disguised as loans. Gangster Johnny Dio, quoted on television by Robert Kennedy, was a recognized master of the labor racket. Born John Giorgardi, he wrote a book on how to profit from labor unions, for which he was invited by various mafia families around the country to share his expertise. Dio was a member of the Lucchese family of New York. He would open garment factories and then make favorable deals with unions that granted him exemptions from all major contractual obligations contained in labor agreements. In this way, Dio could use low-wage, non-unionized immigrant labor, which helped him outmaneuver his competitors. In exchange for voluntary cooperation, union officials were given generous kickbacks. One of Johnny Dio's partners in labor crimes was Anthony Corallo, nicknamed Duck. He got his nickname not because of his love for these waterfowl, but because of his ability to evade convictions. I guess everyone's heard the saying, like water off a duck's back. Dio and Corallo, who once became the boss of the Lucchese family. With Hoffa's tacit approval, he set up 6 organizations on paper in New York. These organizations had no employees, only officials who either collaborated with or were members of the mafia. Eventually, these men gained full control of all air cargo transportation in New York City. The McClellan Committee's findings stated that these gangsters used their position for the purpose of extortion and bribery. In exchange for their permission to rob, Hoffa expected to receive the electoral support of these sham organizations. Stephen Fox tells us in Blood and Power that the McClellan Committee's scheme of wasted and stolen union funds, lucrative contracts, conflicts of interest between employers and union leaders, phony organizations, and denial of democratic processes in major cities across the country. Hoffa was taking orders, not following their orders. And that's where certain troubles begin. In 1970, on Valentine's Day, a small airplane flew over the federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, with a long banner tied to it. The banner bore the words "Happy Birthday, Jimmy." This day was Jimmy Hoffa's 57th birthday. His sentence was almost 5 years. Hoffa received a large number of greeting cards from rank-and-file members and officials of the truckers' union and from ordinary people. However, this support was only a semblance. Although he was still a hero among the workers whose interests he represented, the corrupt union leadership was happy to have her behind bars. Hoffa's appointed successor as union president, Frank Fitzsimmons, was much more to their liking. Fitzsimmons didn't just turn a blind eye to the gangsters' actions, he practically gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted in their union positions. The balanced Fitzsimmons was much easier to get along with than the pugnacious Hoffa. In addition, he was a friend of the current President Nixon and often visited the White House. Fitzsimmons' aura of respectability was the perfect cover for the corrupt dealings of the truckers' union. On the other side was Hoffa, who now presented the image of a crook rather than the most desirable leader. But Hoffa was not discouraged. He was determined to regain power, even though the law stated a convicted felon may not hold office in a labor organization for 5 years after release. Hoffa was well aware that he would have to wait. He planned to get out after doing time, wait 5 years, and then campaign against Fitzsimmons, who continually ignored Hoffa. Hoffa was confident that the rank-and-file members of the organization would support him and believed they would help him return. But while in prison, he also tried to make connections with the mafia. Hoffa's old friend Tony Provenzano was doing time in the same prison for extortion. Provenzano was a capo, one of the higher-ups of the Genovese family and also vice president of the International Brotherhood of Truckers, which gave him access to union funds. In prison, Hoffa and Provenzano were initially close allies. De facto in prison, Provenzano was the most important among the convicts and provided protection for Hoffa. Once Provenzano had a stomach inflammation, and it was Hoffa who convinced the prison authorities to provide him with the necessary medical care. Subsequently, however, the relationship soured. Provenzano wanted Hoffa to help him get a loan from the union to open a restaurant, but Hoffa couldn't pull it off. After their time in prison, a witness came forward who claimed that Hoffa and Provenzano had gotten into a huge fight after accidentally bumping into each other at the airport. In the book A Desperate Deal, Why Jimmy Hoffa Had to Die, it was revealed that Hoffa and Provenzano got into a fight, resulting in Jimmy smashing a bottle over Tony's head and Provenzano promising to rip out Hoffa's heart. Hoffa opposed Provenzano's intention to return to his old position as union vice president after a 5-year period, and Provenzano opposed Hoffa's desire to regain the union presidency. They became a problem for each other, but Provenzano had a reputation for solving problems by any means necessary. In 1963, a prosecution witness in the Provenzano extortion case was shot dead shortly before testifying. In 1972, a man involved in the Provenzano operation simply disappeared. In a case very similar to Hoffa's disappearance, Anthony Costellito, Provenzano's secretary-treasurer at the union, was lured to a New York City neighborhood where he was met by a short, intelligent-looking man named Salvatore Bergoglio, nicknamed Sally Bugs. He is believed to have killed Costellito, however his remains were never recovered. It was Bergoglio who then took over Costellito's position. In 1985, the FBI issued a memorandum stating that Salvatore Bergoglio was the prime suspect in the Hoffa case, along with his brother Gabriel, brothers Stephen and Thomas Andretta, Chucky O'Brien, Tony Provenzano, Tony Giacalone, and Western Pennsylvania mob boss Russell Bufalino. In January 1976 and February 1977, the government issued an internal report based on the interrogation of an informant who claimed to know what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. This informant's name was Ralph Picardo. He was serving time for murder at Trenton State Prison in New Jersey. He was an agent in one of the Union branches and was also Tony Provenzano's personal driver. As noted in the book Hoffa's Wars, Hoffa was invited to the Marcius Red Fox restaurant by Detroit gangster Anthony Giacoloni to sit down with Provenzano. Chucky O'Brien, whose alibi was that he was cutting up a huge fish, actually picked Hoffa up from the restaurant and took him to a nearby house where O'Brien and several of his friends were staying. Salvatore Bergoglio and his brother Gabriel were also there. Also in the house was Frank Sheeran, president of the Delaware branch of the Union. Sheeran was in close contact with mob boss Russell Bufalino and had driven him to Detroit that day. According to Picardo, it was Bufalino who ordered Hoffa, who turned the case over to Provenzano. Bufalino's cousin William had a serious falling out with Hoffa in 1967. Picardo did not say whether Russell Bufalino was actually present at Hoffa's execution, but curiously, Bufalino had traveled from Pennsylvania that day. Perhaps he wanted to personally make sure the pesky Hoffa was taken care of once and for all. Or perhaps it was something personal and he wanted to witness the event himself. Bufalino's exact whereabouts on July 30, 1975 are unknown, but there is no doubt that Hoffa was killed that day in this house. Without a body or circumstantial evidence, Jimmy Hoffa's murder case will not go to trial. But the conspirators did not go unnoticed. Over the years, the government made sure that these men were prosecuted to the fullest extent of other charges. Anthony Tony Provenzano eventually came under government supervision, which became a serious problem in Provenzano's illegal operations. In 1978, he was prosecuted and convicted for the murder of Anthony Castellitto in 1961. 17 years after Castellitto's body was allegedly sulkily dropped by a tree chipper, Tony Pro was sent to prison where he died 10 years later at the age of 81. Anthony Tony Jack Giacoloni was convicted on tax evasion charges and spent 10 years in prison. In 1996, he was charged with racketeering, but died before the case could be tried. Despite the many holes in Chucky O'Brien's alibi, he was never charged in connection with Hoffa's disappearance. He moved to Florida, where he got a job from Union President Frank Fitzsimmons, but in 1990 O'Brien was expelled from the Union for mob ties. In the late 70s, he served a brief stint in prison for some minor machinations. Suffering from poor health, O'Brien survived cancer and for heart bypass surgeries. He died in Florida in 2020 at the age of 86. To the end of his life, he assured everyone that the government was involved in Hoffa's murder. Salvatore Bergoglio was murdered gangster-style in Little Italy in New York City. The hitman fired several shots into his chest and head. He was talking to prosecutors at the time and was about to cut a deal in exchange for his testimony against Provenzano in the Castellitto murder case. Authorities know exactly who killed Jimmy Hoffa. They know exactly why he was killed. The questions that remain are what and where. What was done with his body and where it is. Versions of both plausible and ridiculous abound, and some inmates amuse themselves by preparing scenarios for impatient journalists who are drooling for the scoop of the century. Tons of earth have been dug up in search of Jimmy Hoffa's remains. Now only a few of the versions will be given. According to Ralph Picardo, Hoffa's body was loaded into a 200-liter metal barrel and taken away on a truck. Where exactly, Picardo does not know. Another inmate said Hoffa's body was taken to New Jersey. There it was mixed with concrete and bricked up during the construction of a soccer stadium. Hoffa was buried in a 100-acre gravel pit in Michigan. The quarry was owned by his brother William. Hoffa's body was entombed in the foundation of a public parking garage in Michigan. His remains were buried under the swimming pool of a mansion in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. The corpse was pulverized and dumped in a swamp in Florida. Hoffa was crushed by an automobile press at the Central Sanitary Service in Hamtramck, Michigan. His body was buried in a field in Waterford Township, Michigan. The body was weighted and dumped into one of the rivers Osable of Michigan. The remains were disposed of at a grease processing plant. He was buried under the helipad of the Sheraton Savannah Resort Hotel, which was owned by Profosius at the time of his disappearance. His body was placed in a steel drum and buried at the Jersey City Toxic Waste Dump. Jimmy Hoffa was officially declared dead in 1982, but the case remains open. At least one FBI agent is assigned to his case at all times. More than 16,000 pages have been collected on the case, but despite all efforts, the case remains unsolved to this day.